Student came up to me and he said, "How did you do this?" He was wide-eyed, blood had drained from his face. He was visibly shocked, and I was surprised. I said, "What do you mean, how did we do this?" So he said, "Well, I've been trying to become more creative in my thinking for years. I've read Six Thinking Hats by Edward de Bono, Lateral Thinking by Edward de Bono, Mega Creativity, all the creativity books." And he said, "I always learned a lot, but I wasn't more creative after doing these things." And in that, there's already an interesting paradox. How can you say that you've learned a lot, but you can't actually do the thing that you were learning about?
Yeah. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Business of Learning podcast. My guest here today is Barry Kayton, who is a co-founder and CEO of Cognician. Barry, I'm very excited to have you here.
It's great to be here, Joao. Good to be on the call with you.
Yeah, tell everyone a little bit more about Cognician. You guys have done so much around the world. So for anyone that doesn't know who you guys are, a little bit more about what you do and who you are.
Sure. We are an employee activation platform. So what does that mean? We focus on learning that drives people to action, people in Fortune 500 companies for the most part. And we've been doing this since 2010. It's been a wonderful journey of learning every step of the way.
Yeah, and it's so awesome. And I wanted to highlight something that we actually spoke about before we even started this whole recording. You mentioned that a recent project of yours for over 4,000 employees, in 16 days, you guys were able to increase their Copilot usage by 475%, if I'm not mistaken. So How does that happen? Talk to me through that process. How does that even go down? How are you able to attain those results for the people that you work with?
Sure, absolutely. Joao, if you don't mind, I'm going to go all the way back to our founding story.
1,000%. Go ahead.
Takes us back to the year 2006, where we were running a seminar for the MBA students at the University of Cape Town. I'm originally from South Africa. And I did this twice a year for several years. But in December 2006, something very, very interesting happened. A student came up to me and he said, "How did you do this?" He was wide-eyed, blood had drained from his face. He was visibly shocked. And I was surprised. I said, "What do you mean, how did we do this?" So he said, "Well, I've been trying to become more creative in my thinking for years. I've read Six Thinking Hats by Edward de Bono, Lateral Thinking by Edward de Bono, Mega Creativity, all the creativity books." And he said, "I always learned a lot, but I wasn't more creative after doing these things." And in that, there's already an interesting paradox. How can you say that you've learned a lot, but you can't actually do the thing that you were learning about, right?
No behavior change.
We must come back to that, yeah. And then he also said that he'd been on a 5-day retreat with the winner of the World Creativity Championship. I didn't know that there was such a thing at the time, but he spent 5 days with the guy, and he learned a lot, but he wasn't more creative. And in the seminar, which was just 2 hours long, he immediately started producing creative ideas that were shocking to him. And so he was saying to me, all the effort and time and money he'd spent didn't get him results. And in next to no time, at a free seminar, he got the results he was looking for. How is that possible? So when you ask me, how is it possible, or what was the secret to driving Copilot adoption 475% in 16 days? It's exactly the same thing, right? Maybe not exactly the same thing.
Sure. The framework stands.
The framework stands. The method is there underlying everything. And what we're really up against is the paradigm. I call it the tell and test paradigm, or you might call it the train and test paradigm, which is what we all grew up with for the most part in school, where you listen to the sage on the stage, and that person tells you lots of things, and then afterwards they test you. That's the paradigm of learning that we grew up with, but that we recognize doesn't actually work all that well. And my paradigm is the challenge and change paradigm, which is really about involving people in a process and typically in a conversation. And when you tell people things, they forget. When you show them, they remember. But when you involve them, particularly in conversations, that's when you understand things and when you change.
Yeah.
So tell, forget, show, remember, involve, and change. The challenge and change. And that's what we did with Copilot. We worked with this oil and gas client. They had 4,000 employees. We built a 16-day program for them. Every single day involved a short conversation, which is delivered via software. So it's a conversational modality. We don't call them bots, though. We call them COGs. COGs stand for Conversational Guide. And a COG basically introduces something to you and helps you link this thing that's being introduced to something that's important to you. So, for example, we would ask, what would you love to know before you start a meeting with people, right? And so people will respond, well, I'd like to know the agenda, and I would like to know the most important thing. I'd like to get a summary of the last meeting that we had. Well, okay, now that the person's frame of reference is just right, at that point you introduce the Copilot prompt, which will help to deliver those things that they actually want, right? So it's about framing, and then most importantly, getting a contribution from the audience, and then getting them to go and act. And all of this is done through software. And then, when we ask them to go and try the prompt in Copilot, you might think, well, job is done now. No, job's not done. The next thing we want to do is get them to reflect on what they did, because it's one thing to try a prompt in Copilot. It's another thing entirely to reflect on what you just did, because you can say, well, this was the most amazing thing. I just saved 25 minutes. I'm going to do this every day. And that's what you want. You want people to connect the dots to say, I must do this again. Because once they've made a commitment to themselves, that's what we call an activation catalyst. It makes it more probable that they will do that thing again in the future, which is what we're actually trying to do.
And not even to say, you obviously mentioned 25 minutes, but that's 25 minutes for one person in one day over the course of a week. That's hours compounded for the entire organization of people who are going through this thing. So it's such an incredible, I'll just use the word mind blowing of how efficient things can get if you just do them right. And it sounds like there's obviously many layers to this, but the most important, it sounds like, it's the immersion plus the feedback. It's immerse yourself, get into it, understand what's going on, go through the thought process, reflect.
Yes, you're 100% correct. And in fact, there's one last step, because if you reflect and you learn something for yourself, that's fantastic. But if you reflect, learn something from yourself, and you share that with other people, that's even more fantastic.
Yeah, of course.
So the last catalyst is what we call insights. And by insights, we mean you've reflected on an experience and you've learned something and you share it with other people. So we have in our platform a mechanism for doing that. And your listeners and the audience might think, well, that sounds like a forum, right? Well, the problem with forums is that they can devolve into pictures of cats and videos of cats and movie trailers and all sorts of wonderful things that enrich our lives. But when we ask for insights, the prompt that gets people to share their insights is very, very formalized, so that we get just what we ask for. In fact, that's one of the things we've learned. You get what you ask for almost always. And so we spend a lot of time and effort making sure that we're asking for the right things.
You get what you ask for. I think that's so key. And when people hear it, they're like, yeah, duh. But they don't actually like dive deep into it, especially when it comes to building business. How do you think, actually, maybe how is not the right question, but what's a methodology that maybe you guys have or you think through when it comes to asking the right questions to get the right answers for things?
That's the $64 million question, isn't it?
Yeah.
So one of the things we do a lot of different things, but when we approach a new subject matter or a particular problem that the client is having, we will usually create some sort of content matrix, obviously. And the client will often supply lots of content to us. And what we need to do is we apply what we call the Goldilocks level of guidance. So we examine the content to look for the 20% of the content that's going to deliver 80% of the value. So that's the first thing, even before we get to ask, to figure out which questions to ask. Which 20% of the content is going to carry 80% and deliver 80% of the value. And then once we've got those core concepts, we create, or we go through a process we call CIDI, C-I-D-I.
Okay.
And that basically means that we want to identify the concept. So you can imagine a spreadsheet with a whole column just of concepts. We're naming the concepts. Then we want to have an imperative. So we express the concept as an imperative. And then a declarative, in other words, a description. You could say it's a description. And then an interrogative, a question, right? And when you go through this process, you clarify a hell of a lot of stuff, right? You would think that if you just define concepts, you're A and away. But that's not what we found. And it's when you start asking, what questions can we ask? And the interrogatives are the questions, right?
Yeah.
You can ask questions related to that concept, but when you ask the question, you're starting to link it to what is important to people, right? Let's think of a simple thing like a SWOT analysis, for example,
Okay.
right? The S stands for strengths. Well, you can. It's not about asking what that means, the strength. It's about asking how the strength is relevant to you, the person
Mm,
in the audience, right?
yeah.
So you can link strengths to goals. You can link strengths to struggles that people are having. You can start to unpack what strengths mean in
Mm,
lots of different ways. And so it's a little bit like the concept is coming through a prism. You could think of the dark
yeah.
side of the moon, right?
Yeah.
Coming through a prism, and the colors coming out the other side are all the different perspectives you can take on that particular concept, and you can ask questions on every single beam of light that's coming out the other side.
Hmm. That's so
And
interesting. It sounds like there's it's like people often have a preconceived notion of whatever that thing that they want to know of might be.
yeah,
And they don't know if it's right or if it's incorrect, but usually it's just, hey, I want to find this out, and they go through one avenue as opposed to shining it through this prism and finding out that on the back end there are so many more avenues that they can take and go through that 3-step process, to use the interrogative, in finding the answer. Oh, that's
yeah,
so interesting. That's so interesting. And funnily enough, out a bit of a tangent here. You mentioned Dark Side of the Moon, obviously Pink Floyd as well. I Pink Floyd, "Wish You Were Here" is the first song I ever learned to play on guitar. So
awesome,
not related to anything at all, but that reminded
right?
me of it. And Pink Floyd is and music is huge in my family. So yeah, I just want to
That's
say
great,
that for
right?
no reason at all.
So what just happened there was that you were able to relate something that I was saying to something that's meaningful to you.
Yeah.
That is at the core of our process, right? Which is why we spend a lot of time bringing into our content things that might not ordinarily occur to a learning experience designer,
Hmm.
particularly when a client has their contents all worked out and just put this content in your system, right? No, we're not going to do that.
Hmm.
We're going to look through the content and we're going to try and figure out ways to make the content relevant to people.
Hmm.
And the way we do that is by figuring out what's important to people and then bridging the gap between the two.
That's so awesome. So awesome. And Barry, talk to me a little bit more about the journey that it has been. I'm assuming that obviously you guys have helped some of the world's largest organizations, but I'm assuming it hasn't been all sunshines and rainbows along the way. So talk to me about maybe some of the challenges that you guys had as you were growing the company, and how they differ from the challenges now.
Lots of different challenges, very different challenges today than when we started. But the most significant pivot we had to make was in June of 2007.
Mm.
So we had the idea for Cognition before it was even called Cognition in
Okay.
December 2006. The question we asked ourselves is, how do we scale the methodology? So we
Mm.
went looking for software that could do that. There wasn't any software. And so we said, oh, okay, how hard can it be to build your own tech platform? Turns out it's quite difficult. So we had worked for 6 months on a prototype, and the prototype was a desktop application,
Okay.
and it was actually a mind map and an interactive mind map. So you could put the thing that you were thinking about at the center of the mind map,
Hmm.
and then you could choose a bank. This is called a bank of questions. And then surrounding the thing that you wanted to think about were all these questions that would appear. And then you
Mm.
could answer those questions. And at any other point, you could ask more questions about any of the nodes that you had opened up. And so it was quite amazing. And my brother Patrick and myself, we're the co-founders, we
Hmm.
both love mind maps. And we were 6 months into this journey, and then the earth changed. Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone in
Hmm.
June of 2007. And it was a great moment in tech history, right, when that happened. And we looked at the iPhone, right, and this iPhone here is much bigger than the original one.
Yeah.
This is probably, the original one's probably 2/3 the size
Yeah. And
of
much
this one.
thinner too.
And yeah.
Yeah.
And we looked at that and I turned it on its side and I said, the mind map's not going to work on this, right? You
Mm.
can, I mean, there were already in the early stages mind map applications. So we downloaded a few of them to see what they look like. And because you're on such a tiny piece of real estate,
Mm.
trying to work with a mind map it's just not going to work, right? And so we're 6 months into our journey now, and thinking how are we going to make this work on an iPhone?
Mm.
And so I thought, I wonder if we could turn the mind map into a conversation. So we got our prototype team to actually be able to switch from a mind map version of what we were doing to a conversation. And for a time, we were able to switch between the two
Mm-hmm.
because as you use the mind map, you would, the software would track chronologically what you were doing. And we figured out a way of turning that into a chronological conversation, starting at the top and working down.
Mm-hmm.
But then we realized, well, now we're serving two different kinds of interfaces with a small tech team. And of course, we looked at the data, being data driven, and we saw that most people actually preferred the chat-based conversation. So very, very reluctantly, with heavy hearts and many tears and wailing and gnashing of teeth, we decided to discontinue the mind map version. But that was a significant pivot because, as I say, Patrick and myself love mind maps. And we thought that we still believe that the mind map application has huge potential. But you have to do what you have to do to make the business grow. And thankfully we did. So we had a chat-based interface in 2007 already, long before any of the chat-based interfaces that we know today became popular. Yeah.
That's so interesting, and it's I always love hearing the journey and the struggles in the beginning because there's often so much work that gets done on the back scenes and the shadows that nobody knows about. It's like 6 months, a year of hard work. Hey, let's do this, and it's like actually no, we have to pivot. We're like, oh, it all has gone to waste. But I always like I've always loved the quote from I actually don't know who said this exactly, but it's all work works. It either works on you or it works for you. So it'll work regardless. It's just a matter of where it's going. So
absolutely,
that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that story. And
sure.
How does that differ from the challenges that you guys go through now? I'm assuming obviously the scale and the application of those challenges are very much different. So what are some of the things that you guys face nowadays to keep the company growing?
Well, coincidentally, it's actually a similar but different challenge in that when ChatGPT was released a while back and the whole world woke up to the power of generative AI, the first question that we asked is, does this make us obsolete, right? Because our chat-based modality is not AI, right?
Yeah.
We specifically looked at what AI was capable of back in 2007. And there was just no way AI was going to do what we were wanting to do. So along comes ChatGPT and all the other generative AI interfaces, and we thought, do we abandon our approach? Because our approach is a scripted conversation, right? It greets you. It has various kinds of ways of being dynamic and interactive, but it is a scripted conversation. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And these are designed upfront before the users enter the system. And so immediately, some of our clients began to ask, is this going to work anymore? When people expect dynamic responses throughout a conversation, and our system is much more rigid, much more focused on getting people through a beginning, middle, and end, is this going to work? And our experience is that it still works very, very well. But we had to start asking ourselves, is there some way we can bring AI into our chat? At the same time, we're interacting with these Fortune 500 clients who are saying to us, are you using AI? Because if you are, we don't want you to use AI.
Oh, interesting.
This is a paradox, right? Yeah. I mean, we're currently working with a client. Their master services agreement specifically forbids us to use any AI user-facing. So we started experimenting, and we've just figured out how to bring AI into our system when we want it there, and it's all on a feature flag. So if a client allows us to use AI, we can bring AI in whenever we want to. And we're calling that particular kind of prompt that we use a responder prompt, meaning that we're not going to allow an unfettered conversation in our system, but whenever we want AI to provide its dynamic, adaptive responses, we can do that in the moment and then return to our itinerary, so to speak, the main thread of the conversation. And you might ask, well, why should we do that? Because whoever controls the questions controls the conversation.
Yep.
And so if you give the user full control of all the questions, and sometimes you want to do that, right? When I'm interacting with ChatGPT or Perplexity or Claude or any other system, I want to control the questions that I'm asking. But with Cognition, we want to control the questions, unless we want at a particular point to ask a user to share their questions. In which case we can have a question, we can bring in AI, let it respond, and then return to the main thread where we control the questions. Because it's in controlling the questions that you can control the conversation, which is what we're doing right now. I've ceded my autonomy to you as the interviewer to let you control the conversation, and that's the contract, the implicit contract in this conversation, right?
And it's
So
the
there we
same
are.
thing that you guys do. That's so interesting. And I found it, So there's clients who don't want that because they want you to have that control. And there's clients who are like, hey, we need to adapt and we need to do all those things. And how is that, or is that a factor that impacts the growth of the company when you guys are looking to acquire more clients, more similar partnerships to keep the company growing, and obviously the impact and everything else that most companies want to achieve, but particularly looking at company growth?
Yeah, so we see AI as a huge opportunity for us. The ChatGPT, the Copilot example that we mentioned earlier, we have a number of different clients where they're using our system to drive the adoption of Copilot, but we also have clients using our system to drive the adoption of Gemini. And you name it, we can drive the adoption of these platforms rapidly. Yeah.
Awesome. Very, very cool. Barry, I have two final questions here for you. And we'll start with one that I've been asking everybody because I think it takes the ceiling off, takes the roof off, and just lets people think, which is, if you had a magic wand and you could just wave this amazing magic wand like Harry Potter, and you could just solve one problem, one challenge, one obstacle within the business that will make hitting your growth goals much, much easier, what would you want to solve? What's that one thing?
By the way, I love the question. I actually use that question quite often myself,
Amazing.
with clients and internally with our team.
Great.
We right now are working on an authoring system to allow our clients to have full authoring control over our system. And if I could wave a magic wand, that authoring tool would be ready tomorrow. So it's really about reducing the roadmap, from several months down to several hours.
Interesting. So is it about giving them a little bit more quote unquote autonomy over the process of how they are operating with Cognition?
Yes, it's not just autonomy. We're a bottleneck. So our team is trained to use our internal authoring tools, and then we create these solutions for the clients, and they're let loose with the client's audience. But the much, much bigger play for us is to have an authoring package that allows the clients to do this work themselves. That opens up to a whole range of different kinds of clients. Our biggest fear in this process, which is not going to hold us back, is that if you give the client the authoring tool, are they going to use the authoring tool the way our team uses the authoring tool? So if I can use a PowerPoint analogy for a moment, we've all had death by PowerPoint, right? We've all sat in presentations and thought, is this never going to end, right? Because the people who created, or the person who created the PowerPoint presentation, was not using PowerPoint to its best strengths, right? Instead, they just dumped content into it. So that's our fear, right? And so in mitigation of that fear, we've created an activation academy, which just launched a couple of days ago. It basically takes what we've learned about how to activate employees, how to get them into action, and turn that into a 9-hour course, essentially. We don't call it a course. Awesome. It's an activation program that helps you activate other people. And so that's one of the methods. The other is building in AI assistants throughout the whole authoring tool. And those AI assistants will be able to review your work in the system and say, you could actually change this prompt that you're giving to people, make it more meaningful, have the right level of guidance. If you change it in this way, it'll get more commitment from your audience.
Very cool.
If the author is writing reflective questions, the AI will be able to review those and say, if you change it just slightly, you're going to get better results.
That's really, really awesome. Yeah, so it helps the prompt engineering of that too as well.
Yeah.
Awesome. And final question here for you, Barry. It's actually not a question from me. It's a question from our last guest to you, and they had no idea who you were. So ready for the question?
Sure.
What keeps you up at night in today's climate of maintaining and running a business?
Data security. We spend an enormous amount of effort and time making sure that our team is fanatical and obsessive about data and information security, because our clients expect that. And more importantly, we ourselves take our clients' data and privacy very, very seriously.
Hmm.
So if anything, I mean, we begin every single executive meeting with information security. That's the first thing before we even get to the agenda. Yeah.
Awesome. Very,
Yeah.
very cool. Barry, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing all your insights.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation. As for someone watching, as you may have noticed, there's a amazing bright orange slash yellow little thing here, which is Barry was kind enough to send to me. So Barry, where can people go if they want to learn a little bit more about you, about Cognition, or maybe this amazing thing here?
Cognition.com, and your autocorrect will change it to TION. So you don't want to do that. You want to go to COGNICIAN. Cognition, spelled like statistician or magician. Yeah, we are the magicians of getting people to act. Right.
Awesome. Barry, thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Shah. Have a great day.